can do, right? Just take a big deep breath. We are 7 days.
5 more seconds of that, Nina, please. 5 more seconds of deep breaths.
We're 7 days into 2021, and this is, all of our hopes and dreams and fresh starts. We're going to have another fresh start. Joining us live this morning, and thank you so much to you for getting up early again with us, Dr. Jim Moore, the political science professor at Pacific University. Jim, we were all, watching on our mini TV monitors yesterday when all of this started. It sounds like you were doing the same. You tune in to see how this electoral, count is going to go. It starts with a few squabbles. You see, live pictures from outside where there was a lot of people. And for a while, it was all fine. And then, we know what happened. Do you have class today, first of all, Jim? And, whenever you see your students next, what are you going to tell them?
I don't have class today. We have a January term, and mine starts on Monday, actually.
Okay.
And I'm teaching a class on the Middle East. And the Middle East is a place that is filled with things like this. Yep. Think 10 years ago, right now, it was the Arab Spring. What we saw yesterday was Egypt. Mm-hmm. What we saw yesterday was the beginning of a civil war in Syria. And so it's going to bring things home to students in a way that I haven't been able to get to them because it's something far away. This is not far away. This is American symbols, American property, American people, and arguments over who the people really are. That they watched and from however far away they watched it, they could feel a visceral connection to what was going on. So it's going to be really interesting to talk to the students and say, okay, we're talking about these things far away, but look, this is it. Mm-hmm. This is that feeling that you felt. That's what a whole country feels, or that's what people who feel that they're aggrieved feel. Really bringing it home to them.
It is sobering when I hear you compare the United States to Syria and the beginning of a civil war. It's interesting that you say that because my phone was blowing up yesterday with texts from people that I have not heard from in a very long time. And that's what they wanted to know. Are we starting a civil war? Because that's what it looks like. This is horrifying. This is stunning. Can you say more about the dynamics of that?
Sure. I don't think we're going towards a civil war of any kind. I think this is still a big social split in the United States, and partisanship is now the number one part of that social split. But compare that to 30, 40, 50 years ago, race was the number one part of that social split. Right now, it's partisanship when you look at the country as a whole. The reason I don't think we're moving towards a civil war is there's no general, there's no organization. It's all around the person of Trump. And Trump is going to leave office and he won't have power anymore. There's a lot different when, say he goes and starts his own television network and has a show. It's a lot different having 10 million people watch your show than being the president of the United States with a megaphone where 320 million people listen to everything that you say. And so I don't think we're moving towards a civil war, but this really speaks and illustrates the divisions in our society that have really been aggravating for about the past 40 years, and they've now reached some really interesting breaks. Think about what we saw yesterday. There was one picture that really struck me. It was a picture of people with a police shield who were battering in a window in the Capitol building to get inside. That was exactly Salem, Oregon, about 2.5 weeks ago, when people were trying to get inside to a special session and battering the glass door to try to get inside. So things that we've been seeing in the states, Michigan and Oregon, tend to be places where those play out the most. We're now seeing on the national stage. So it's stunning, but I don't think it's quite as bad as people are thinking for the worst case.
Jim, we just had you on Sunrise Extra Monday. It seemed like 3 weeks ago now, but it was actually just 3 days ago now. And we were talking about what was going to come on Wednesday, now yesterday. We talked a lot about it for 20 minutes, and we knew it was going to be a historical day, but we obviously did not see what happened yesterday unfolding. So, how surprised were you? Because we even talked on Monday about, hey, this will be, in the end, just sort of a routine event where the votes will be counted and Joe Biden will be determined the president of the United States here officially with his inauguration in 2 weeks. And then yesterday went down the way it did. So how taken by surprise were you yesterday?
I was very taken by surprise. When you think about it, if you take out the 4 hours of the rioters in the Capitol building, it was a routine event. The only thing that changed from the routine was because of the rioters. I just was reading something, apparently about 5 o'clock Eastern time, Ted Cruz, when they were in their secure location, took the 10 senators who were going to oppose Biden's votes. They took them into another room and said, okay, what are we going to do, people? So there was apparently serious talk about whether or not we go ahead with our objections or not. Right. They eventually decided to on 2 states. So that was different. But if you take the riot out, it was a rather boring day, a historic day, but basically a boring day. But the riot really adds something to it. It shows us that there are people in this country who are so frustrated with our government that they think that they should go and shut it down because it's not giving them what they want. In this case, giving them 4 more years of President Trump. So they just want to shut it down. And when you do that, when you leave aside what the United States has prided itself on now for 240 years, the rule of law, when you leave the rule of law behind, then the outcomes are much less clear. The players are much less clear, and there's a lot of confusion. And that's what, I don't know, I was listening to Nina. She was saying that she eventually had to lie down and kind of, set back from it. Yeah. That kind of confusion, that kind of hopelessness, that kind of, oh my gosh, what's happening? That's a classic example of what happens when you leave the rule of law and people are pushing really hard for change of some kind, whatever it is.
And Jim, I want to go back to what you were just kind of touching on, and that is the most kind of depressing, disgusting part for me as I was kind of trying to sum up the day last night before I went to bed. And it's just the fact that, aside from these rioters and this violent mob, that there is such deep ingrained game playing and this whole farce of lawmakers on both sides who play this game of, they want to get reelected, they want to have all of these supporters. And so, in this case, there's these Republican senators who have this whole time gone along with Trump's false narrative of fraud, 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 and let's, find these ballots any way we can. And then when it comes to the 11th hour of when they, Mitch McConnell, my jaw dropped yesterday when, before all of this started, his speech on the floor was shocking. And about face, he finally, took the high road and said, enough is enough. We cannot, in good conscience, on mere allegations, destroy our democracy. But then it took this riot and for these, lawmakers to be genuinely scared for their life, I'm sure, for them to finally flip and say, all right, game's up, we won't contest these electoral votes. And, Kelly Loeffler made big headlines last night. And of course, she was, a staunch supporter of something like that. But it bugs me to no end that it takes a riot like this for them to finally say, okay, game's up. We won't do it anymore. What's your take on that?
Yeah, no, you're exactly right. But there's a pattern, especially in democracies, that you get into a pattern of relationships. That can be party relationships, government relationships, your role as a voter, whatever it is. You get into those, and it takes something big to whack you out of that. And big things in the past have been things like the Great Depression or World War II. Or, for those of us who are a little bit, younger than that, but older than you guys, the Vietnam War, that shook people out of their regular patterns. And what yesterday was a shaking out of the regular patterns. It was showing the logical consequences of what could happen. It's not just a could anymore, it's a will. It will happen. The striking thing, though, is that it happened because the spark was the President of the United States. He's the one who gave the talk, who said, go get him. And the crowd said, wow, the United States president just said, go get him. Let's go get him. And that's something from outside the government looking in. You look at it and say, what on earth is going on? Sure. We got reports yesterday afternoon, later on, there was a big thing. The Pentagon would not authorize the National Guard to go hit the streets. So the National Guard would not be armed, they would be unarmed, but they'd be supporting the police officers as they were doing their thing. And the Pentagon wouldn't authorize it. And then a while later, about an hour and a half later, we heard that all 1,100 National Guard in D.C. and a couple of hundred from Virginia had been activated and they were going.
Jim,
we found out later on, the President of the United States, who is the head of the National Guard in Washington, D.C., because it's not a state, it's a city, he had refused point blank to authorize the National Guard to go help deal with the mayhem that he had started. It took Vice President Pence stepping in and basically giving the order saying, activate the National Guard.
Jim,
When
let's
you
talk
find out
about
things
law
like that,
enforcement
that's
just a
really
little bit
troubling.
more. Okay, because I think that is one of the things that surprised me most, is that the Capitol was that easy to breach. There's been lots of reporting out there saying that once those rioters got past the barricades that were dozens and dozens of yards away, there was really no other plan. And the police were overwhelmed. Now, the Capitol Police is not a small force. The Capitol Police is huge. It's as big as city police forces in some of the major cities. So how on earth can that happen, that they don't have contingency plans that run from 1 to 50? We've got Jeff Lucas on our stream saying, did this just give real terrorists an idea of how they could bring down the U.S. government? I mean, you have to wonder.
Yeah, there's a couple of things to say there. First of all, the way the Capitol defense is set up is because of 9/11. So it's looking for a focused, truly terrorist attack. People are calling what happened yesterday terroristic, and it was in a large sense, but it wasn't a small group of 20 trained people who were going to do X, Y, and Z. That's what the Capitol is set up for. So when they hustled everybody out of the Senate and House chambers, the secure areas they went to were areas that had been created since 9/11 for exactly that kind of possibility. The other thing, though, is, the Capitol Force is huge, but they didn't have a plan B. It's like they didn't believe that crowd at the other end of the mall might come marching towards them. That's a huge, huge breach of security, and it's a huge breach in planning. You think, you talk to people in the Portland police force, they always have kind of a plan B and a plan C. What happens if people go over here? What happens if they go over there? And you can agree or disagree with it, but they've got a plan. It was clear that the Capitol Police did not have a plan until they got to the actual chambers, and then there were police forces in the chambers ordering senators and House members and members of the media what to do and where to go and that kind of thing. It's tremendous. I know that there's going to be a lot of talking about it, but Congress, because they were the butt of it, Congress is going to change this quick. They just had to figure out what to change it to.
I have a question from the audience. That audience is Rod Hill. Rod's not in the room right here with us, but he's in the Weather Center. He texted me a question for you, Jim, because Rod says the last time you were on with us, just a few days ago, you mentioned that Trump was doing this, rallying the troops, so to speak, because he really wants to run again in 2024. Rod is saying that that's what you mentioned last time. So Rod's question today is, can the Republican Party simply say no to him? You know what? We don't want you to run again.
They cannot. He can run if he decides to run. What the Republican Party can do, however, is show that it's gone in a different direction. Remember, Donald Trump had run for president before he got in 2015. He's one of the also-rans several years ago, and the Republican Party was not a Donald Trump party at that point, and so he didn't do well. I think a year ago, there were still about 22 Democratic candidates. The Democratic Party eventually said in its own way, no, you're not right for us. We're moving on. This is where we're going. So that's what they can do. But there is talk, and there will probably be things filed today. If you impeach somebody and they are removed from office, and you can impeach somebody and convict them even after they have left office. If that happens, you are forbidden from running for public office again. And so there's a chance that there may be a movement by the Congress to, in effect, have a prophylactic impeachment to keep Trump from running in 2024. That would be extreme, but that's kind of the only really certain way to keep him from running.
Yeah. I want to ask you about the Oregon protest down in Salem in 1 second, but I want your kind of final thought of the other. I was more interested in hearing from Republicans last night because we know what the Democrats are going to say. And the person who really, besides Mitch McConnell, who really stuck out to me last night was Mitt Romney in his comments after they came back into chambers when everything was cleared. And gosh, boy, it is so true what he said. And this goes for anyone in any situation, even your kids. The best way we can show respect, he says, for the voters who are upset is by telling them the truth. It's like your child, you know, I mean, you wouldn't lie to your child about something and, you know, increasingly get them upset. What was your kind of takeaway? He had a very impassioned speech, and, you know, he was the only Republican that voted to impeach.
Yeah, no, it was an amazing day for Mitt Romney. And remember, his seat is right behind Senator Hawley.
Yeah, we saw
so
it.
Hawley was the one who was going to object to everything, and he gave a talk, and you could see Mitt Romney just kind of glaring at him from behind, saying, "You caused this. You're one of the reasons this is happening." It was an amazing day for Mitt Romney. But has the Republican Party moved to where Mitt Romney is? Short term, absolutely. You know, your comment about Mitch McConnell giving an amazing unity speech that he has not, those words have not come out of his mouth in decades. That's amazing. But does the Republican Party go to where Mitt Romney is, or does it just back away from Trumpism a bit? That's what we're going to wait to see.
What
and
do
we'll
you
know
think?
pretty quickly as we look at the 2022 elections.
Well, which do you think is going to happen? Can you even venture a guess?
Yeah, I think that this shows that Trumpism is pretty hollow. It's based on just Trump, and the Republican Party needs to figure out what it's going to do. You see the Republican Party beginning to do that. For instance, now that Biden is coming in, all of a sudden they're worried about deficits again. And that's been a tried and true issue for the Republican Party. So I think that they're going to begin to move that. This will accelerate it because a lot of people in the Republican Party who hold office or who are voters are going to look at this and going to be appalled, and they're going to say, no, we need to get our party back and go back to what worked for us. Remember when we elected George Bush for 2 terms? That was a good thing. Let's try to get back to that kind of thing.
Right. George Bush has not come out on very many things at all since he left office. And he, you know, was one of the ones yesterday putting out statements. I mean, it really has galvanized so many of the Republicans who have either chosen to kind of stay out of the current administration or, you know, whatever their opinions are. They all came out yesterday. But you have to wonder, you know, where were they before? Because I was saying during the show, I felt like when I was listening to speeches on the national news coverage, before they put up the supers from all these different states, I'm like, is that Democrat or is that a Republican?
It was hard to tell,
they
right?
Talked about
Party lines
unity.
were blurred, right?
And boy, oh boy, I haven't heard that in forever.
Yeah, you wonder what was going through George W. Bush's mind, because the images yesterday, a lot of them reminded me of when the crowds hit the streets after the United States took Baghdad, and the crowds were just ripping things apart, going into presidential palaces. I remember pulling over that statue of Saddam Hussein. You know, it had that kind of feel to it, and I'm just wondering what George W. was thinking as he was watching that. It's like, wow, you know, that's happening in my country where I used to work, where I used to be the president.
You know, maybe this is just wishful thinking, Jim, but when we look back at 2020, of course, we'll always remember it as the year of COVID. It was also a political year where we said, man, has this country ever been so divided? I looked at yesterday, and you know, people were calling it a black mark on the country's history. We'll never forget that day for all the wrong reasons. But maybe this is a day where we did get unified again, because I'm thinking if you, even if you voted for President Trump, if you voted for him because you consider yourself a Republican and that's the way you normally go, you know, maybe yesterday was a day where you said, you know, enough is enough. I mean, obviously he has his extreme supporters, and we saw them plenty yesterday. But I'm wondering if this is actually an event and a day that can maybe bring the country back together closer, so where we're not so divided.
I think there's a good chance we could begin to move that way, especially as we look at that, combine it with the COVID response. Health is the number one thing. If we all of a sudden start looking at the response to COVID, getting the vaccine out as a less partisan issue, I think that could build on what we saw yesterday and really move things. You know, right after the election, I was looking at the Oregon results, and I wrote a little piece that looked at where Trump supporters are and where Biden supporters are in Oregon, because we see the blue counties and the red counties. And you know what? The weird thing is the vast majority of Trump supporters live in the blue counties. Multnomah County had the third highest number of Trump supporters of any county in the state. Clackamas County, number 1, Washington County, number 2. Why? Because that's where the people live. Right. And we tend to look and say the blue and the red tells us who we are. No. Your neighbors voted for the other person. The people you go to school with, the people you work with, the people that you see when you walk in the morning, they voted for the other person. And something like yesterday can shake us out of where we've been in our silos and maybe have us look around and say, oh, I need to understand what's going on over there. And I need to help them work through things if they reach out and need that kind of help. Because, you know, I've been on the losing side of elections. It hurts.
I like that part, yeah.
But, you know, when you go on beyond that, it's got to stop hurting. You've got to say, okay, so how do we work with the next group coming in?
What do you make of, we saw, many protests at state capitals around the country, including Olympia, and we covered the one in Salem that was declared an unlawful assembly with several arrests and violence, people throwing punches at each other, screaming at each other. Where do we stand here in the Northwest, do you think? We've got COVID shutdowns clashing with, that's why people broke into the Capitol a couple of weeks ago. Now we've got, the pro-Trump supporters clashing with counter-protesters. What do you kind of make of our local issues now?
Well, it's interesting because especially in Portland, and it's begun to happen in Salem, protest is a normal way of dealing with political issues. And that's fine, that's great. But there are a number of people who've in fact become professional protesters.
Yeah.
We heard from some of them actually from Oregon who went to D.C. just to be there for the big protest or observe it yesterday. And those professional protesters, they skew things because their interest is in the protest and not the message, but the protest itself, the conflict, the facing off. That's what they're really into. And hopefully what happens in DC can come back here where we can look at the protest here and say, okay, what's your message? Let's work on the message. Let's respond to the message, not to the techniques that are being used, maybe by you, but certainly by the professional protesters who want to break windows and get into conflict and that kind of thing.
All right, we will have to...
It'll be a big change because everybody here in the Northwest, in Olympia, Salem, and Portland, is kind of locked in, and Seattle as well, locked in. The police play this role, the protesters play this role, the Antifa play this role, the Proud Boys play this role, and those roles are like kabuki theater these days. They don't really advance us towards finding out, so what do we need to do so that your protests make change happen that we're happy with and you're happy with.
Yeah, so true.
We will have to leave it there. Jim Moore promised that you will come back 2021 getting off to a raucous start. I know that this conversation will continue, and we appreciate your insights and your perspectives, giving us some context. Jim Moore, political scientist at PSU, Pacific University. Sorry about that. Thanks for watching. Hope you guys take care and have a great day.